I was still holding the navy blue leather client ledger when Victoria Langford slid into my chair. Not literally, just in the way she leaned back, crossed her legs, and smiled at the conference room like she'd just been crowned. Her father, Paul Langford, our VP of operations, beamed at her from 2 seats away. "My daughter will be taking over David's accounts," Paul announced, as if 22 years of client trust could be transferred like a stapler. "I'm David Kensington, 48 years old, Senior Client Strategy Director at Stratium Global Partners. For more than 2 decades, I'd been the quiet constant behind our biggest accounts, the person who could call Berlin at 3 a.m. and have an answer before sunrise. That ledger in my hand wasn't just a list of names. It was 2 decades of relationships, handshakes that had outlasted mergers, favors traded in airport lounges, deals rescued at midnight over bad coffee. Victoria. She'd been in the building a month, a strategic hire fresh from a marketing internship, with a resume padded by family connections and summer conferences her father paid for. She didn't even look at me when she said, "I've already got some fresh ideas for the Hartman account." Across the table, Paula Merrick, our operations director, shifted in her seat, lips pressed tight. Paula and I had weathered 3 CEOs and more market storms than I could count. She didn't speak up, but her eyes said it all. This is going to be a disaster. Martin Keene, our CEO, wasn't in the room. If he had been, maybe this power grab would have been slower or quieter. But with him traveling, Paul and Victoria had free rein, and they were taking it. I placed the ledger on the table deliberately, the sound of leather meeting wood louder than it should have been. "Those clients trust the person holding this book," I said, my voice even. "That trust doesn't come from a title." Paul's smile didn't falter. "It will once they see her results." 3 weeks later, they'd see results all right, just not the kind he was expecting. I didn't have to chase my clients. They chased me. Before I go deeper into how that happened, comment where you're listening from. I always like knowing where these stories travel. And hit like if you've ever watched someone's arrogance write their own ending. Because what started in that room wasn't just a personnel change. It was the opening move in a game they didn't know I'd already been playing for years. I didn't speak after Victoria's announcement. Not in the hallway, not at my desk, not in the elevator ride down to the lobby. It wasn't silence out of shock anymore. It was the kind you hold when you know words would only give them something to use against you. I'd been with Stratium Global Partners for 18 years. Started as a junior account manager in my mid-20s. Long before compliance became a buzzword, every VP suddenly claimed expertise in. By 47, I was Senior Client Strategy Director, managing 8 of our top-tier accounts, each worth more than most divisions. You don't get those by accident. You earn them by showing up at 2 a.m. when an overseas client's licensing approval stalls in Brussels. You earn them by catching the typo in the customs form before it delays a multi-million-dollar shipment. That's why it felt less like a demotion and more like a corporate amputation. Victoria Langford had been at Stratium for all of 5 months, fresh from a marketing role at some boutique firm. She had a last name that could bend company policy, because her father, Paul Langford, sat in the corner office as VP of operations, the kind of man who never actually said family comes first, but lived by it, if the family was his. From the day she arrived, Victoria treated client meetings like they were just another stage for her. Once during a quarterly review with Sven Hartmann, one of our most meticulous German clients, she tried to reframe the conversation by tossing out jargon she barely understood. He messaged me after David is an intern. I told him I'd handle it. And I did quietly without making her look bad. Because back then, I thought protecting her reputation was the same as protecting the company. It wasn't just her, of course. Paul's influence had been creeping further into day-to-day operations for months. Deals I'd normally oversee were suddenly being redistributed to his preferred staff. Policy memos came down with no compliance review, no legal vetting, the kind of shortcuts that might save a week on paper, but cost you a client for life. Then there was Paula Merrick, our operations director. She'd been my counterpart for a decade, sharp, deliberate, allergic to politics. She saw what was happening, but in Stratium's hierarchy, observation was safer than intervention. Still, I noticed the way she'd linger after certain meetings, tapping her pen against her notebook, like she wanted to say something, but didn't. And above it all was Martin Keene, our CEO half a continent away, most weeks chasing expansion deals in Asia. He wasn't in the building when Victoria replaced me, and I doubted he even knew. That was the point. In my desk drawer sat the navy blue leather ledger I'd been keeping for years, not for accounting, but for memory. Every handshake, every client dinner, every moment where trust had been built or broken, I wrote it down. Not in a spreadsheet, not in some cloud server Victoria could accidentally access, but here ink on paper initials beside each entry. The day after the announcement, Victoria stood in the glass conference room, already rearranging my client list like it was a seating chart. Paul hovered in the doorway, arms folded, a silent stamp of approval. I caught my reflection in the glass as I walked by, steady eyes, even breathing ledger tucked under my arm. No outburst, no protest. Because here's the thing. When you've been underestimated for long enough, you stop needing to prove yourself to the room. You start planning for the moment the room needs you back. 3 weeks later, that moment would arrive. And when it did, they wouldn't just need me, they'd have to say my name. Victoria Langford's heels clicked down the hall like a countdown clock, each step sharper than the last. She swept past my old office without looking in, but Paula Merrick caught my eye from the doorway. One raised brow told me something was coming. It landed an hour later in the form of a panicked call from Sven Hartmann in Berlin. His renewal paperwork with the European Trade and Licensing Authority had been filed 3 weeks late. ETLA doesn't just fine you, they fine you retroactively. $84,000 for each week you're out of compliance. I could almost hear him doing the math. The irony. Those renewal dates were once printed in the navy blue leather client ledger that never left my desk. A ledger Paul Langford's streamlined process had deemed unnecessary when they decided my job could be done by someone with fresher ideas and a shinier title. When you delegate regulatory filings to someone who thinks ETLA is a trade expo, well, you can guess the rest. I didn't have to move a finger. The lapse happened because the one person who'd built the system to prevent it was no longer in the building. Victoria arrived in Berlin the next day, perfume and panic arriving in equal measure. I could picture her rehearsing the apology Sven would never accept. Once it starts, it never stops spreading. Missed filings, breed audits, breed doubt, and doubt is contagious. Ever watch someone try to talk their way out of a hole? They dug themselves. It's like watching a fire from across the street. You smell the smoke long before you see the flames. I thought back to that Tuesday afternoon in the glass-walled conference room when Victoria told me we need new energy in this role. I'd smiled then, knowing full well that energy without experience is just static. By the time the quarterly meeting rolled around, the cracks wouldn't just be visible, they'd be structural, and everyone in Stratium Global Partners would see exactly where they started. 3 days after Victoria's first strategy meeting, an email landed in my inbox at 6:42 a.m., subject line, Client Account Transition Notice. It was addressed to the senior leadership group, but copied to me almost as an afterthought. Effective immediately, the following key accounts will be reassigned to Victoria Langford to support strategic alignment with our growth initiatives. The list read like my career condensed into bullet points. Hartwell Industries, Arden and Bray, TerraTech Solutions. Clients I'd personally brought into Stratium Global Partners, nurtured over years through supply chain crises acquisitions, even a bankruptcy rescue. It wasn't just numbers in a CRM, it was trust built handshake by handshake. Below the list was a short paragraph: David Kensington will transition to an advisory role for 30 days to ensure knowledge continuity. That wasn't a role. That was a countdown clock. I read it twice, then a third time, scanning for the courtesy of a conversation that had never happened. Nothing. Just corporate neatness and the scent of inevitability. At 8:15, Paula Merrick stopped by my office. She didn't sit, didn't smile, just closed the door behind her. I saw the notice, she said quietly. Guess I'm here for 30 more days, I replied, forcing something like humor. Paula leaned against the doorframe. They didn't loop me in either. Martin signed it yesterday afternoon. Paul was in the room. I nodded, the pieces sliding into place. Paul Langford wasn't just greasing the wheels for his daughter. He was clearing the road entirely. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the navy blue leather client ledger. It had been a gift from my first mentor at Stratium, back when notes were still written by hand. Inside were 12 years of client histories, decision-maker preferences, and off-the-record truths that no CRM could hold. If I handed this over, Victoria would look like a genius in her first quarter. If I didn't, well, she'd have a very public learning curve. I set the ledger on my desk, its weight heavier than it should have been. Paula's eyes flicked to it, then back to me. She didn't ask. 30 days, I said again softer this time. That's not a handover, that's an erasure. That afternoon, Victoria appeared in my doorway. She didn't knock. I'll need that ledger by Friday, she said, like she was asking for a stapler. I kept my expression neutral. The ledger is my personal property. Company files are already on the shared drive. Her smile was pure rehearsal. David, this isn't personal. It's about ensuring client continuity. I met her gaze. Continuity isn't a file, it's a relationship. And you just reassigned every one of mine without a conversation. She shrugged. Change is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. She left without waiting for an answer, her perfume lingering in the air, like a signature on a contract I hadn't agreed to. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, with the ledger open, flipping through pages written in my own hand. Notes in the margins from dinners in Chicago, plant tours in Frankfurt, last-minute problem-solving in Singapore. These weren't just accounts, they were the living proof of why clients picked up when I called. It hit me then, this wasn't about survival anymore. This was about legacy and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when Stratium stumbled, the clients would remember who actually solved their problems. By the end of the evening, I decided I would follow every transition request document, every so-called handover, but I'd do it in a way that gave Victoria exactly what she'd earned. The minimum necessary to meet the letter of the policy, nothing more. And when the gaps started showing, I'd already know exactly where the calls would come first. I closed the ledger and locked it in my briefcase. 30 days. That's all the runway they had given me, and all the time I'd need. What I didn't know then was that by the following week, one of those clients would force a meeting that neither Martin nor Paul could spin in her favor. Paul's email landed in my inbox at 7:42 a.m., flagged urgent copy to Victoria, Martin, and the department leads. Effective immediately, all international renewals were to be routed through Victoria's office for efficiency. That word again, efficiency. I'd heard it in every corporate obituary I'd ever read. On paper, it was a simple workflow change. In reality, she'd just put herself in the center of every compliance-sensitive process for the next 6 months. The European Trade and Licensing Authority doesn't care about power plays or optics. You're either on time or you're not. And the penalties aren't abstract, they're numbers you can't talk your way out of. I opened the navy blue leather client ledger, running my thumb over the worn spine. Every account, every contact, every renewal deadline was in there written in my hand. I'd built this list over decades, not for Stratium, but for the people who trusted me to keep them in the clear. Victoria now had no idea she was holding a loaded schedule with every round chambered against her own name. For a moment, I wondered if I was waiting too long. Maybe I should have moved sooner, pressed harder. But traps don't work when you spring them early. They need time pressure and a target convinced they're safe. So, I smiled, closed the ledger, and let her policy start the clock for me. By the third week, I could see the seams starting to fray. Renewal notices from Berlin and Rotterdam sat unanswered in her queue. The ETLA certified audit calendar was still on my wall, the red marks like quiet countdowns only I could hear. And then came the first sign. The tide was turning. One of those names from the ledger, a client I'd personally saved from a $2 million fine 5 years ago, was about to reach out. Before I go further, have you ever had someone sabotage start working in your favor, not by accident, but because you let it? Think about how that feels. The email from that client hit my screen at 9:14 a.m. Subject line, lunch my treat. I didn't have to open it to know the leverage it carried, and I knew exactly where this would lead. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere at Stratium Global Partners had shifted. The quiet confidence Victoria carried into every meeting had thinned into something brittle. In the Tuesday status review, she'd interrupted Paul twice, then let him speak for 12 minutes straight without actually listening. I'd seen that pattern before. It meant she was counting the hours until someone else would have to carry the blame. The first crack came from a client in Denver, a mid-tier account that usually kept to itself. Paul Americ forwarded me a thread from their operations manager, polite but pointed, asking why their quarterly compliance update was late and why Victoria's office was redirecting their inquiries to junior staff. The message was CC'd to 2 other client VPs. That wasn't an accident. I didn't respond directly. Instead, I slid my navy blue leather client ledger across my desk, opened to a page I'd updated the night before, and quietly emailed the same Denver VP from my Harbor and Crane account. The reply came back in under 5 minutes. We'd prefer to resume working with you, David. Can we set a time? Victoria didn't know it yet, but that was the first domino. By late afternoon, Paula stopped by my office unannounced. She shut the door, leaned against the frame, and said, "They're starting to notice. And not just Denver. She didn't have to tell me who they were, the list of legacy accounts I'd personally onboarded over a decade. I let her talk just like I had in that side hallway 6 weeks earlier, when she first hinted she might be looking for a change herself. That conversation had been my first reminder that patience not speed wins wars in corporate corridors. At the Friday leadership call, Victoria tried to steer the narrative. We're experiencing some minor handover delays, but nothing material. Her voice was tight, each syllable pressed flat, like she was trying to iron out the wrinkles in the story before anyone else saw them. Then Lance Devereaux, head of sales, unmuted himself. "Minor. We've had 4 accounts push back their renewal discussions this week. And Sven Hartman's team in Berlin is asking why Daniel isn't handling their licensing review." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. I kept my camera off, but I couldn't stop the smallest curve of a smile. It wasn't about spite, it was about the precision of the moment, the kind you can't rehearse, only earn. I didn't push further, not yet. Timing is leverage, and I'd learned long ago that pulling the trigger too early wastes the element of inevitability. Before we signed off, I asked almost casually, "Victoria, do you want me to send over my old audit templates to help Trevor get ahead of the ETLA backlog?" The pause before her answer was the longest of the day. "No," she said finally. "We have it under control." But the quiver in her voice said otherwise. I closed my laptop, ran my hand over the smooth grain of the ledger, and thought about every handshake in that book, every name, every date, every meeting where trust was built in rooms far from Victoria's reach. That wasn't just a list. It was gravity, and it was starting to pull her down. The question was, how much further could I let her fall before I made the drop permanent? Paul Langford's voice came first, a slick blend of charm and threat. "David, this isn't the place for personal grievances," he said, smiling across the polished boardroom table, as if he were the reasonable one in the room. "We're here to talk about client continuity. Let's stay professional." I rested my hand on the navy blue leather client ledger, the one Victoria had tried to get locked in HR storage. The weight of it was grounding. Continuity is exactly why we're here, Paul. Because what you've set in motion will do the opposite. Victoria sat at the head of the table, posture rigid, a faint, impatient click of her pen, betraying the calm mask she'd worn all week. Martin Keene, the CEO, leaned back in his chair, watching. Paula Merrick was 2 seats over from me, her notepad angled so I could see the words "let him hang himself" scrawled in her neat script. I slid a printed copy of the ETLA compliance letter across the table. "This came in yesterday. They've flagged irregularities in the last shipment logs, 3 in Berlin, 2 in Hamburg. All signed off by your new team without the required dual verification." Paul's smirk faltered. "Minor discrepancies. Easily explained." "Then explain to Sven Hartman," I said, leaning forward. "He's already asked why my signature isn't on the approval chain, given it's in our contract, that I'm the primary compliance officer for his account. Section 4.2 subsection C. The clause you both ignored." Victoria's eyes flicked to the ledger, then back to me. "We've adjusted workflows. It's within our rights." "Not when those adjustments violate international licensing agreements," I replied. "And not when they trigger a formal ETLA review." "Do you know what that means?" "Victoria. It means the client can terminate without penalties. That's $32 million in annual revenue gone. All because you wanted my job title erased before Q3. The room went still. Martin's pen tapped once against the table. "Victoria, is that accurate?" She shifted in her chair, voice tight. "We were streamlining. The old system was working. I cut in. For over a decade. No fines, no holds, no revoked licenses. Until now." Paula's eyes met mine, a flicker of satisfaction passing between us. The leverage was on the table in black and white, and they knew it. For a moment, I remembered the first time I'd met Sven over coffee in a cold Berlin conference room. He'd told me trust is built slowly, but it vanishes all at once. I hadn't known then how soon that would matter. Victoria straightened her shoulders, looking at Martin instead of me. "We can fix this. David is exaggerating the risk." I opened the ledger, letting the pages fan out just enough to reveal the neat handwritten records, years of client notes, preferences, and contract renewals. "You can try," I said, "but Sven called me personally. He's already asked for a meeting next week, at Harbor and Crane Consulting." The silence after that was a living thing. Martin's gaze shifted slow and deliberate from Victoria to me. Before anyone could speak, I gathered the ledger and stood. Continuity. Paul, this is continuity. The kind where the client chooses who they trust. And right now, it's not you. Walking out, I felt the heat of Victoria's glare on my back. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the first time she'd tasted what losing felt like. I've learned something in moments like this: revenge doesn't land in a single blow. It's a series of small, deliberate cuts until the other side finally realizes they're bleeding out. And when that realization hits, that's when you know the endgame is close. If you've ever had to stand your ground while someone tried to erase you, you know that exact feeling. Hit like and subscribe. I've got more to show you before this is over. The Etzla review is now live, and Victoria is about to discover that some doors don't just close, they lock from the outside. By the second week of the Etla's preliminary review, the cracks were no longer rumors, they were in every corridor, every meeting, every nervous email. Victoria Langford's polished confidence had started to fray at the edges. The woman who could once control a boardroom with a single glance now kept glancing at her phone, mid-sentence scanning for updates she couldn't control. It started small. A Berlin-based client quietly paused their quarterly renewal, citing pending regulatory clarity. 2 days later, a major Nordic shipping partner froze all new orders, invoking a clause about export compliance vulnerabilities. Paula Merrick didn't say a word in those meetings. She didn't have to. Her notes were already in front of the CEO, Martin Keene, who was trying and failing to steady the board's nerves. And through it all, the navy blue leather client ledger stayed in my briefcase, closed, untouched. I didn't need to open it now. Every signature inside it was already working against them. Once months ago, I'd have been tempted to make a call or leak a detail to hurry things along. But there's a point where the current is so strong, all you need to do is stand still and let the tide carry the wreckage past you. An email thread from a supplier crossed my desk, a request for clarification on Etla licensing terms. I could have forwarded it to the press with one click. Instead, I archived it. Not yet. Because the best part wasn't the loss of contracts or the panic in the boardroom. It was knowing that all of it was happening without me lifting a finger now. The plan I'd set in motion months earlier had its own gravity, pulling Stratium Global Partners into a place they couldn't climb out of. One afternoon, I passed Victoria in the hallway. She didn't meet my eyes. Her phone was pressed to her ear, her voice low but sharp. I don't care what the Etla says, find me a way around it. That was the moment I knew the fight was no longer between her and me. It was between her and the truth was winning. The next blow would be public, loud, and impossible to walk back. 3 weeks after I'd left Stratium Global Partners, the first headline hit the morning feeds: Langford expansion faces client exodus. I didn't have to read past the subhead to know which clients they meant. Every name listed was inked in my navy blue leather client ledger, the one Victoria had mocked as old school during her first week, waving it around like it was a relic. The article quoted sources close to the matter about sudden contract withdrawals, citing breach of strategic trust. I knew exactly which breach they meant the day Victoria replaced me with herself, and thought clients would just stay loyal to the company. They weren't loyal to Stratium. They were loyal to the relationships, and those relationships lived in that ledger. It wasn't just PR trouble. Paula Merrick forwarded me an internal memo. That morning, redacted headers, and all showing that Harbor and Crane, consulting my new home, had quietly signed 4 of Stratium's legacy accounts in the past 10 days. She didn't need to say the obvious. Those signatures looked a lot like my handwriting in the margins of their onboarding packages. Paul Langford tried to stem the bleeding with a hastily arranged client retention summit, flying in executives and dangling last-minute incentives. But corporate hospitality can't erase the memory of a CEO's daughter-in-law fumbling through regulatory clauses she barely understood. One VP in Frankfurt reportedly walked out mid-presentation after Victoria misquoted a compliance deadline by 6 months, the same clause I'd highlighted in yellow in my ledger every January for the last decade. There was a moment, brief but real, when I wondered if I'd gone too far. Watching from the outside, the collapse felt almost surgical. I'd built Stratium's international network with patience. Now, I was watching it dismantle under the weight of their own arrogance. It was the same patience that had kept me quiet when Victoria smiled across the table and called me replaceable. That's when I realized this wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about making sure the people who trusted me for years weren't left in the hands of someone who saw them as bullet points on a quarterly report. I ran my hand over the leather spine of the ledger before sliding it back into my desk drawer. It wasn't a trophy, it was a reminder of the promises I'd kept, of the bridges I'd chosen not to burn until the time was right. The calls from industry reporters kept coming that week. I didn't answer. I wanted the last word to happen on my terms, and that moment was still ahead. One more step, one more blow, and there'd be no saving them. 2 weeks after the trade show, I got an email from Paula Merrick. The subject line was short, almost polite. Victoria would like to meet. The address she gave wasn't the Stratium Global offices. It was a private lounge at the Whitmore Hotel, the kind of place where corporate damage control gets done, behind oak-paneled doors and a $20 cup of coffee. When I walked in, Victoria was already seated in a corner booth. She had the same flawless posture and expensive stillness she'd worn the day she slid my termination letter across the table. Only now, there was a fine tremor in the way her fingers tapped against a leather folio. Paul Langford sat beside her, jaw, tight eyes, flicking between me and the exit. On the table in front of them sat something I hadn't expected: my navy blue client ledger, the one they'd boxed up with the rest of my office. It was closed, but the way Paul glanced at it told me they knew what it represented. David, Victoria began, voice low and rehearsed. This isn't about the past. It's about moving forward. We're prepared to offer you a senior advisory position, contract basis, of course, premium rate. You'd retain your client relationships, and we can smooth over any misunderstandings from earlier this year. I let the words hang there like steam over a cooling cup. 6 months ago, I might have killed for an offer like that. Now, it sounded like a buyout of my silence. She leaned forward, the perfume familiar, the tone almost maternal. You know the landscape. Harbor and Crane might give you flexibility, but we can give you reach. Let's be adults about this. I glanced at the ledger, then back at her. Adults, I said, don't burn bridges and then try to rent them back by the hour. Paul shifted in his seat, clearly unused to being on the back foot. You could make this easy on everyone, he said. I smiled, not out of humor, but at the sheer predictability of it. Easy, I repeated. That's the one thing you never gave me. I slid the ledger toward me, slow and deliberate, as if reclaiming more than just paper and ink. I'll hang on to this, I said, rising from the booth. You'll see why soon enough. Their silence followed me out into the marble hallway, the kind that comes when people finally realize the conversation isn't going their way. Next time we'd speak, there wouldn't be an offer. There'd be an ending. The navy blue leather ledger was heavier than I remembered. It sat on the table between me, Paula Merrick, and the 3 Harbor and Crane partners, like a piece of evidence in a courtroom. Inside were 12 years of Stratium Global Partners client records, every contract amendment and compliance certification I'd ever overseen. Not photocopies, originals, my initials, my annotations, my signatures. The same documents Victoria Langford had once dismissed as relics from a paper era. I slid the ledger toward Julian Crane, the senior partner already open to the flags section. A single contract tabbed in red, a European Trade and Licensing Authority certification with a 6-year exclusivity clause, one that made their $40 million expansion into Hamburg legally impossible without my sign-off. Julian's eyes moved from the page to my face. You're sure Stratium doesn't have another copy? They might, I said evenly, but without my counter-signature and the matching verification from the outla. That copy is just decorative paper. Paula cleared her throat, her voice calm but edged. And that verification. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket, pulled out the single notarized page, and set it on top of the ledger. Authenticated last Thursday. Under Harbor and Crane's name. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of shifting calculations. Victoria's voice was still in my head. From that day, she locked me out of Stratium's server room. We're moving into a modern era, David. You're not essential. I let the partners absorb the clause's weight before I spoke again. When they signed this, they agreed any successor contracts required the original compliance officer of record to endorse them. They didn't read it carefully because I was the one who drafted it, and I wrote it with one purpose: to make sure it couldn't be stolen. Julian closed the ledger slowly, like it was made of glass. When do we move? I didn't answer directly. Instead, I slid the ledger back toward myself and fastened the clasp. You'll know when Victoria does. That night, Paula texted me a single line from the Stratium boardroom. She just found out the Hamburg deal died in front of the entire board. The next morning, I sent my final email to Victoria from my Harbor and Crane account, 6 words and a scanned image of the ledger's cover. Not all relics lose their value. Some things didn't need more explanation. And yet this wasn't the part I'd been waiting for. That was still ahead. I didn't expect the silence to feel louder than the headlines. 3 months after the Harbor and Crane deal closed, Stratium Global Partners was still unraveling in public view. Paul Langford resigned for personal reasons. The same week the trade press published leaked board minutes showing his role in falsifying compliance reports. Victoria suddenly, without her brother-in-law's shield, stepped down from the client portfolio committee and hasn't been quoted in an industry article since. Martin Keene tried to frame the whole thing as a necessary restructuring, but investors weren't buying it. They had watched a firm once trusted for its discretion get pulled apart on the record. The European Trade and Licensing Authority's investigation didn't end in fines, at least not yet, but the legal fees alone gutted their operating budget. Half their senior analysts were poached by competitors within 6 weeks. Harbor and Crane picked up 3 of Stratium's largest clients without a single RFP process. They just walked over, bringing their contracts with them. I should have felt triumphant. In a way I did, but mostly I felt finished. Not with the work I still loved, the puzzle of international compliance, but with the part of me that had once cared about proving myself to them. That navy blue leather client ledger still sits on my desk, though I don't need it anymore. The last time I opened it was the day after my first Harbor and Crane board meeting. I ran my thumb along the spine, remembering the way it used to fit in my Stratium briefcase like a secret I carried everywhere. Now, it's just a reminder of 2 things: the people who trusted me with their business and the cost of letting someone else decide your worth. I think about what would have happened if I'd stayed. If I'd tried to weather the Langford's slow erosion of standards, kept my head down, and told myself it was just business. Would I still have a corner office? Probably. Would I still have the respect of those clients? Doubtful. And I would never have learned how quiet revenge can be when it's done right, when it doesn't need a victory lap, just results. In the end, it wasn't about watching Victoria's title disappear from the company website or hearing Paul's name whispered in industry gossip. It was about standing in a conference room at Harbor and Crane, looking around at a team that didn't need reminding why they trusted me. That was the real win. And maybe it was about knowing that the ledger will outlast all of us, silent proof that the relationships you build are the only real currency worth keeping. Share your own experiences. Like and subscribe for more stories.